Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Kugelman. I am the Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia with the Asia program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. Before I forget, I also would like to thank our co-sponsor, our Wilson Center co-sponsor for this event, and that is the Middle East program here at the, the Kissinger Institute for China in the United States. Pardon my apologies for that. So the subject of our event today is the U.S.-India-China triangle. And to be candid, I was not a very good geometry student back in the day when I was in school, so pardon me if I get a few things wrong in what I'm going to say over the next minute or two. But perhaps the best way to describe this U.S.-India-China arrangement is as an isosceles formulation. This is a triangle where not all sides are necessarily equal. One side is quite smooth and straight, the side that represents the U.S.-India relationship, which, despite some considerable bumps and obstacles in recent months, is a fairly cordial and deepening partnership. It's growing and in a largely linear fashion. The other two sides of the triangle, however, are less smooth and have a lot of jagged lines connecting them. So here I refer to the U.S.-China and the China-India relationships, which are complicated, to say the least, and have had many ups and downs over the years. So we're not talking about an equilateral triangle by any means, but it's still a critical triangle, a critical isosceles triangle for the geopolitics of Asia and the world. It's a story of the relationship between the world's superpower and two of the world's biggest rising powers and how they all interact. And several policies that have come out in recent times, China's Belt and Road Initiative, the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy, India's Act East policy, among others. These are policies that have all had considerable implications for this triangle. So our discussion today will highlight what is happening with this triangle, both within it, around it, in the broader context of Asia and Asian geopolitics. Our discussion will mainly offer an Indian perspective, but we will also have commentators who will articulate a Chinese and a U.S. perspective. And we have a terrific group of panelists for this discussion. You'll have their bios in front of you. I won't read the whole thing, but we're very fortunate to be joined today by Ambassador Nirupama Rao, who is our speaker. She is a colleague of mine. She's a Wilson Center Global Fellow and a former Public Policy Fellow here at the Wilson Center. She's one of India's most distinguished diplomats. She served in the Indian Foreign Service for 4 decades, and her positions, as you all know, included Foreign Secretary as well as Ambassador to the U.S. and China, among other postings. She was also Minister for Press and Cultural Affairs at the Indian Embassy here in Washington, Deputy Chief of Mission in Moscow, and spokesperson at India's Ministry of External Affairs. And more recently, she's held a series of academic positions at Harvard, at the University of Maryland, at Brown, and just this past fall, she was an adjunct professor at Columbia University. And what does not appear on the bio is that she also has a remarkable singing voice. So if any of you are ever fortunate to hear her sing, it would certainly be a very good thing. We're also joined by our two commentators this afternoon. One of them is Yun Sun, who is co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center, and her expertise lies in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries. She was previously at the Brookings Institution and also at the International Crisis Group, where she was the China analyst. And before that, she was working on U.S.-Asia relations in Washington. And finally, our other commentator is Daniel Markey, a senior research professor at SAIS and also academic director of the Master of Arts in Global Policy program there. He was previously a senior fellow at Council on Foreign Relations, where he focused on India, Pakistan, and South Asia. He wrote a book on the future of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship while he was there, which has the very colorful title of No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. He's now writing a book on the geopolitics of China's new role in continental Eurasia. He was previously at the State Department, where he held the South Asia portfolio and the Secretary's policy planning staff, and before that, he taught at Princeton University. So it's a great group of speakers. I will cede the floor in just a moment. In terms of the format, very standard. We'll first hear from Ambassador Rao, and then we'll hear from our two commentators. I may then ask a few questions, and then we'll go to the audience. So with that, I cede the floor to Ambassador Rao.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon to all of you. I am going to begin with where I'm used to beginning, which is with Indian foreign policy. And in the last 4 years of the Modi administration, I believe we have not seen any deviation from a previous norm, except for much more energetic and greater leadership level visibility and the declared intention of Prime Minister Modi to make India what he calls a Vishwa Guru, or leading power. The fundamental aims of strategic autonomy, independence of action, non-interventionism overseas except for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, being a democratic, responsible stakeholder, all these continue from the previous Congress-led government, although the Hindu nationalist tradition is to reject Nehruvian thought. There is, as has been observed by many apart from me, no new normative agenda for Indian foreign policy, except that in April 2015, the BJP, that's the Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party, national executive, did enunciate what they say, it's a Sanskrit word, panchamrit, which is a kind of distillation of ambrosia, you can say, of the 5 pillars of Indian foreign policy being Samman, which is dignity and honor, Samvad, being engagement and dialogue, Samriddhi, shared prosperity, and Suraksha, regional and global security. Now, turning to Asia and the Indo-Pacific, which is really the theater of our discussion today, I think the primary challenge before us is to get a big and yet finely granulated picture of Asia today from the geopolitical point of view, and how space and power are being contested between various players. Now, the question is the key to Asian dominance going to be the control of the sea or control of the Eurasian heartland? And it follows from that, does the Indo-Pacific comprise the Eurasian heartland too? Is the future going to be determined by an everlasting struggle among competing nations? How is the idea of Asia going to be forged from all this? Because Asia today is a matrix of not so well-balanced networks of power, rising ambitions, definitely, contested borders and sovereignties, as our title would indicate, vital maritime lines of communication, rising aspirations and expectations of its youth bulge. In India alone, with a population of over 1 billion, 65% of the population is below the age of 30. And of course, a number of strategic fault lines in the region. Now, geography is relentless, you'll agree, and that with historical memory shapes India's foreign policy. The control of the rimland, to use Mackinder's term, surrounding India is now dominated by China, both as a result of her presence in, and some would say occupation of Tibet, and in the 21st century, her leveraging of the Belt and Road Initiative in Central Asia through Kashmir into Pakistan, and the development of the Gwadar port at the apex of the Arabian Sea. Now here, the strategic space, it seems, is restricted for India. China has made similar inroads into Sri Lanka and the Maldives. There is a clear competition here between India and China for power, influence, and dominance. I'm talking of South Asia, the former Indian subcontinent. Now, seen from space, the continent of Asia is segmented between the heartland and the ocean. The region of Northeast Asia, with Japan, Mongolia, the 2 Koreas, and China, have shared historical experiences, cultures, ethnicities, and a similar geographical environment. Southeast Asia encompasses the periphery of the South China Sea and the passageway to the Indian Ocean. It is, in my view, the true Indo-Pacific, the linkway between the two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific. South Asia, with India at its heart, crowns the Indian Ocean, and here the rimland of the Himalaya descends through the Indian geographical plate into the ocean in a merging of the geopolitics of Mackinder and Mahan. And further north, of course, there is the heartland of Inner Asia, comprising the various stans, including Afghanistan, Chinese Xinjiang, and Tibet. To the west, there is the Near East, Iran, and the Anatolian spaces, and the Arab states of the Gulf region. All in all, what we see is a cartographic juxtaposition of difference rather than any underlying unity. Asia is not really one, and there is one mammoth external player in all this, which is the United States of America, a dominant presence in the region since the early 1950s. The late Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, a realist, ascribed Asian stability and economic growth to the overarching presence of the United States as the regional balancer. That was a view that was particularly relevant in the Cold War years. But what has happened since the end of bipolarity in international relations to the situation in Asia? Have not old conflicts decompressed, and who is filling the vacuum? In the words of one expert, the rise of China has become the focal point of anxieties about Asian insecurity. And the ensuing scenario, as extrapolated, involves a stiff competition for power and influence, anti-access and area denial, regional domination between the United States and China, inspiring theories that a Thucydides trap is being laid in the region. Hans Morgenthau called the aspiration for power the distinguishing element of international politics, an undeniable fact of experience. And today we see a risen China in the East, and a China that is determined to mold the destinies of the smaller nations who cannot speak truth to its power. The saga of the Belt and the Road, or the One Belt, One Road, is a living example. Through this signature project, China is enveloping nations like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, for instance, in what almost echo patron-client relationships of times past, except that these smaller nations are going deeper into debt to the Chinese in arrangements that are mired in opacity and suggest a gradual attenuation of sovereignty over national resources. The Belt and Road Initiative has been described as the world's largest economic endeavor, potentially encapsulating 60 nations and more than 4.4 billion people. Simply put, Mackinder's and Mahan's theories find perfect partnership, as has been pointed out, in this project that bears the imprimatur of China's supreme leader, Xi Jinping. Projects subsumed under the initiative, as you all know, include gas and oil pipelines, railroads, economic corridors, and ports. And the theaters of engagement include the Eurasian heartland as well as the Indian Ocean. So this is China's road to superpower status and its imaging of manifest destiny, with all roads literally leading to Beijing. Now, speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore on the 1st of June, Prime Minister Modi spoke of how today we are seeing the assertion of power over recourse to international norms. And no prizes for whom he was hinting at. He was basically alluding to the example of the Belt and Road. He said these initiatives must be based on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, consultation, good governance, transparency, viability, and sustainability, empowering nations and not placing them under an impossible debt burden. The message was amplified further when United States Defense Secretary Mattis spoke the next day at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He spoke, in fact, just a few days after the U.S. Navy's Pacific Command, based in Hawaii, was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. And Mr. Mattis was unequivocal in his references to China and in his critique of China's militarization of the resource-rich South China Sea for purposes of intimidation and coercion, as he termed it. Of course, the Chinese reaction was sharp, and Mr. Mattis's comments were termed irresponsible and unacceptable by the Chinese spokespersons. Now, Mr. Mattis referred to the principled realism of the Trump administration of taking a clear-eyed view of the strategic environment and recognizing that competition among nations not only persists in the 21st century, that in some regard it is intensifying. So the American strategy to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific, he said, would focus on preserving the vitality of the maritime commons as a global good by helping partners of the U.S. build naval and law enforcement capabilities. Interoperability, a key word, among a network of U.S. allies and partners would receive attention. Besides strengthening the rule of law, civil society, transparent governance, he called it the sunlight that exposes the malign influence that threatens to stain all economic development, obviously, speaking of China. The centrality of ASEAN, and as we see the ASEAN summit happening this week, in the regional security architecture would be supported, he said, and this architecture would be strengthened. And then he calls out to India for its role as a leader and a responsible steward in the Indo-Pacific region, speaking of a natural partnership with India based on a convergence of strategic interests, shared values, and respect for the rule-based international order. Now, it's clear that the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States has China at its core. And for the first time in a century, the formidable power of the United States is being threatened by the phenomenon of China's rapidly growing economic plus military reach and capability. And obviously, the administration here in Washington is taking a hard-nosed, clear-eyed view of this new competition and the potential it creates for intensifying tensions in the Indo-Pacific. For us in the region, uncertain times are ahead. And furthermore, as you perhaps realize, there are great gaps in power and capability between China and the rest of the Asian countries like Japan, India, and Indonesia. So the geopolitics of Asia today points to a U.S.-China binary, and both countries are circling each other, watching each other's moves. The U.S., as I said earlier, is looking to strengthen the coalition of her interests in the Indo-Pacific, as also alliances and partnerships in this connection, and that's where India is seen as a natural partner, a sister democracy with shared values and commitments to a rule-based or rules-based regional order. And China, meanwhile, marches to the beat of her own drum, pursuing her agnostic version of regional influence building, with a clear aim, obviously, of outperforming the Americans and the Indians and the Japanese, and you can name the rest. So Jawaharlal Nehru, our first prime minister, in fact, whose birthday or birth anniversary is being celebrated or commemorated today, once said that India was the pivot of Asia. And he sought to outline a vision of Asian resurgence, I'm talking of the 50s, of India and China being the prime determinants of a new Asian identity of countries liberated from colonialism and foreign domination. And it's natural, for an Indian leader of that era to have seen India and China as the two new emergent nations in a post-colonial world with a rich civilizational heritage, kind of mother civilizations for Asia, defining this new vision of Asian identity. But it was a vision that evaporated after the debacle that India faced in the border conflict with China in 1962. And today, the unresolved question of the world's longest disputed land border and the questions that arise out of Chinese activities in South Asia, including Pakistan, and in the Indian Ocean littoral states, continue to loom large over the bilateral relationship between the two countries. So the politics of South Asia is very much an India-China binary. And the fact is that as the second decade of the 21st century draws to a close and the world tries to cope with the advancing tide of Chinese strategic ambition in Asia and around the globe, India sees her relationship with China as growing increasingly complex, contested, and competitive. We are neighbors, but we are imperfect neighbors, and the nearness of geography cannot bridge our geopolitical differences. Last year, in the summer of 2017, we saw the unfolding crisis of Chinese and Indian troops confronting each other at Doklam, a high mountain plateau in Bhutan near the border with Tibet. And that crisis taught us that for all the talk of building common ground and strengthening cooperation despite unresolved boundary disputes, talk that has prevailed for 3 decades now, the edifice of bilateral relations was developing serious cracks and showing its constructional flaws. China, as an advancing power, had ambitions that would inevitably clash with a re-emergent giant country like India. And there would be no doubt that the future of the Indo-Pacific would essentially be defined by the tensions and pressures created by the operation of Chinese power and influence and the latter's threat to the current international order. It is obvious that for the democracies of the Indo-Pacific, the essentially non-transparent and unprecedented advance of China necessitates a long-term strategic vision. That vision not only needs conceptualization, but also its operationalization cannot be indefinite. Now, will China peacefully coexist with Asia? I think Joseph Nye used the term cooperative or competitive, cooperative and competitive rivalry, or words to that effect. Will that be the case? China's neighbors are definitely apprehensive. Even in Pakistan, the country that the Chinese refer to as their iron brother, the inordinate debt burdens placed on the country by the ongoing execution of the CPEC projects have been difficult to ignore in the political space of the new government of Prime Minister Imran Khan. The Chinese dream that an aspirational China seeks today under President Xi Jinping includes the ambition to reshape the strategic landscape of Asia, the Indian Ocean, and Europe through the Belt and Road Initiative. And it has life-altering implications for countries en route in terms of development, it is true, but also in terms of what their future will look like. It seems as if China is shaping the geopolitics of our century on its own terms, and many smaller nations have been overwhelmed by the consequences. And you see that playing out in Sri Lanka today. Its Hambantota port story is a parable of how the Chinese came, they saw, and conquered for our times. And you see the playing out of the current political crisis in Colombo also, which perhaps is a spillover from all this. In the recent past, we have seen important policy statements from the United States on how the time has come to redefine and redraw policy towards China, and how the patterns of engagement of the last 4 decades with that country have long passed their use-by date. This is a new era of great power competition, as the U.S. National Security Strategy released a few months ago termed it. The Japanese were the first to speak of a free and open Asia-Pacific, and now an Indo-Pacific, and voices in support of the concept have become much more definite in articulation today. The concept takes as its underpinning a rule-based strategic and dispute resolution architecture, freedom of navigation, unhindered maritime passage, and ensuring that the sea lanes through which much of the world's trade passes today, India is included, between East and West, are not prey to militarization and the threat of force. Vice President's recent speech at the Hudson Institute, where he spoke of ways in which China has sought to advance its strategic interests across the world with growing intensity and sophistication, and how the U.S. has been negatively impacted by the operations of Chinese policy in diverse spheres, is an example of this. Secretary of State Pompeo has said that a free Indo-Pacific means that all nations should be able to protect their sovereignty from coercion by other countries. The key word is coercion. And that at the national level, free means good governance and the assurance that citizens can enjoy fundamental rights and liberties. Territorial and maritime disputes must be resolved peacefully, and all nations should enjoy open access to seas and airways. The message is very clear. The Chinese record in the region has not met the test of these requirements, as spelt out, of transparency and conformity with internationally accepted rules of functioning. Now, with India, between India and China, the brotherhood phase in our relations, the dream sequence, as I call it, ended in the run-up to the border conflict of 1962 and was buried in the battlefields of that short but bitterly fought campaign. In middle-class India, the memories of that war have not faded, even though India and China have maintained peace on their borders for over 4 decades now, with no exchange of fire despite the transgressions of the line of actual control between the two countries by personnel of either side, depending on whose version you're hearing. But the confrontation over Doklam last year gave India a rather full exposure to the Chinese playbook on territorial disputes in a rather graphic manner. The Chinese way, and this has been pointed out by scholars like Tarapore and Skylar Mastro, is to first enforce physical presence in a disputed area and follow it up with threats of coercion, claim she has all the legal right to be present in the territory in dispute, and raise the temperature by rhetoric in the media. But unlike in the case of those countries who have maritime disputes with China in the South China Sea, India was not coerced and stood up to China in the case of Doklam. Of course, the Chinese aim could have also been to generate strains and pressure on India's relations with Bhutan, perhaps the most important of our bilateral relationships. Now, you all know, of course, that Prime Minister Modi made a visit to Wuhan earlier this year in a trip that was billed as a reset of relations with China. The atmospherics of the visit were cordial, but this continues to be a relationship in therapy after Doklam. Long years ago, Mr. Nehru, who I referred to, who incidentally is perennially accused in India of having been soft on China, told a group of Indians embarking on a visit to China that the challenge between India and China runs across the spine of Asia, the backbone of Asia. For most Indians, that continues to be the challenge. India obviously needs to leverage her being different from China more effectively. Openness, transparency of functioning in the region, promoting the idea of South Asia, all the 8 nations involved in this region, as an integer, with India being willing to provide non-reciprocal advantages in trade and connectivity to smaller neighbors, dealing with the asymmetries of power and influence created by China through better neighborhood relationships between India and the countries concerned, efficient delivery of development assistance and capacity building and democratic governance, the deployment of maritime strength and capability, and deepening relations with the United States, Japan, Australia, and the ASEAN countries are all important and integrative responses and requirements in this process. At the same time, for India, an open breach in relations with China, barring a serious disruption caused by military conflict, is not visualized. India has its own national growth strategy to pursue and fulfill, and an increasingly aspirational young population whose livelihood needs must be met. Its northern borders are unquiet, and the Pakistan relationship is troublesome enough. The trade and investment links with China, as they have grown over the years, indicate how evolved this relationship has become. China is our largest trading partner in goods. Some 20,000 Indians study in China, young Indians study in China today. The two countries constantly interact and share common interests in many multilateral forums and are involved in the building and strengthening of new coalitions of shared interest like the BRICS and, of course, offshoots like the New Development Bank, as also the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. But India, situated where we are, has nevertheless to be extremely dexterous in approaching the developing situation in the Indo-Pacific, as tensions fueled by China's rise and its actions create a backlash backed by the United States. The strategic and indispensable, as it's called, partnership between India and the United States is the most important of the foreign policy relationships for India today on the global and regional stage. When you are posited against what are seen from India as the hegemonic aspirations of a new power in the region, China, that is also non-democratic, there is strengthened reason to work with democracies in the region, and particularly the United States, which is an Indo-Pacific country, and to meet this challenge across the spine of Asia. More than strategic autonomy, perhaps, the best terms to define India's foreign policy moves in the Indo-Pacific would be flexible geometry, a term first used by Prime Minister Modi in 2016. India's focus on Southeast Asia and the ASEAN must intensify. The Act East policy has gained good momentum, but the organic connectivities between India and this region must be leveraged more effectively. The northeastern states of India, who are naturally linked to Southeast Asia through the ties of history, ethnicity, custom, and tradition, as also geography, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands should be key catalysts in this regard. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, are a chain of islands in the southern Bay of Bengal, just almost sort of grazing the coast of the most western of the Indonesian islands. So there's a very little gap between India and Southeast Asia in that context. So the strategic importance of the latter needs leveraging to our advantage, the strategic importance of the islands. And we may recall the words of the Indian historian Panikkar, who said in 1945, I quote, "The Gulf of Malacca is like the mouth of a crocodile, the peninsula of Malaya, as Malaysia was then called, being the upper, and the jutting end of Sumatra being the lower jaw. The entry of the Gulf of Sumatra, and hence the Malacca Straits, can be controlled by the Nicobar," and that's the southernmost of the island, Indian island chain that I referred to, unquote. India has to orient her strategic thinking more purposefully to focus on the defense of her coastline, which is both an asset and a vulnerability, if you remember India's colonial history. Her vulnerabilities have to be transformed into assets through improvements in infrastructure, business friendliness, speed in execution of projects, and strategic tie-ups with partners like Japan and Singapore, as also an expansion and deepening of ties within the quadrilateral. Today, even more than her mountain frontiers, India's coastal installations and harbors are her front line. There's also need to dwell on the import of the two terms power and influence. Now, India is well poised to exert influence far exceeding the scope of her present power quotient. She's been, in my view, overcautious and rather hesitant about taking the steps in this direction. Recently, one of the Australian think tanks, the Lowy Institute, published an Asia Power Index, and I referred to the power gaps between China and the other Asian countries. And the same index refers to the distinction between the measures of power and the measures of influence. And the challenge before India is how it converts its resources into more effective influence in Asia. Her diplomatic influence must be energized through intelligent choices of non-allied defense partnerships, building networks of economic relationships which deliver in terms of process and execution. I think the mic is probably gone off.
You can try to project as much as
Yeah, I'll use my singing voice.
Yes, right, exactly.
A sophisticated projection of soft power and being a model of inclusive, rule-based, and tolerant democratic good governance. India must be prepared to be a serious competitor to China in promoting its interests in the Indo-Pacific, understanding that, as Matt Pottinger of the U.S. National Security Council said recently, referring to China and the United States, competition will be at the forefront of the relationships we have, the US and India, with China as time goes by. Conflict, of course, is the antithesis of development, and the Indian Ocean was in ancient times the mare liberum of Hugo Grotius, who said, "For do not the ocean navigable in every direction with which God encompassed the earth, and the regular and occasional winds which blow, offer sufficient proof that nature has given to all peoples a right of access to all other peoples," unquote. So the Indian Ocean, in which India is situated, is the junction really between east and west, north and south. It's essentially a human sea. And it has been for centuries. It has been so for centuries. And today it's vital, of course, to our commercial and trade lifelines and to our maritime security. And what we are witnessing today is a new edition of the great game, a nexus, as Kaplan calls it, of world powers and possible conflict in years to come. So factors like democracy, energy security, religious freedom, they're all at play here. And India's power and influence will not go untested in the future, and she needs to be better prepared. In particular focus, I think, will be national character, national morale, the quality of her democracy, of diplomacy, military preparedness, and good governance. And this is how really the weight and the breadth of India's actual power will be judged. And it's really this prism through which India must view the Asian geopolitique, of which she is a major constituent. And I think in all this, and the underlying, theme through all this is that India's relations with the United States must develop much more intensively, particularly in the strategic and defense sectors. Interoperability with US defense forces need not be regarded in India as an area of risk in terms of closer involvement. Old attitudes and residual prejudices within the establishment in Delhi about the United States must be exorcised. And same time, policy influencers in the United States, particularly in Congress, must develop a deeper empathy about India's own security and strategic interests in her neighborhood and her near abroad, as with Iran and with Russia. India's deploying of a flexible geometry in protection of Indian interests should be comprehended more profoundly. For India, the strengthening of dialogue and cooperation within the quadrilateral of United States, Japan, and Australia, and India, of course, is the right way forward. I personally feel that objections to Australian participation in the Malabar maritime exercises naval exercises should be reviewed and a way found for including Canberra. This must also include a clear way forward on infrastructure cooperation and development projects in the Indo-Pacific on the lines of the paradigms already established in the India-Japan context, this global strategic partnership that we have with Japan. And I'm citing the example of the Africa-Asia Growth Corridor. So what I've tried to do in these remarks is to kind of set the context in which we are situated today in a very rapidly evolving situation in the maritime Indo-Pacific, and I've also tried to bring in the heartland of Eurasia into our consideration. And I look forward to our discussion with colleagues here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Rao, for a very rich and comprehensive presentation, and one undergirded by some very useful references to history and some of the great thinkers of international relations. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to go to our two commentators to offer some brief comments. So first we'll go to you, Yun.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. And thanks to Wilson Center for having me here today. And thanks the ambassador for your enlightenment. I definitely learned a lot. So I'm a China analyst, so I'll focus on what I know, which is China's policy. And I'll talk briefly about China's policy, how China perceives India and how China perceives its policy in the South Asia in the context of India's presence, and how, last but not least, how China sees the Indo-Pacific strategy so far, although that perception is also rapidly evolving. So first of all, in terms of China's grand policy or grand strategy towards South Asia, although there are the existence of multiple bilateral relations, but if you look at the core of China's policy towards South Asia, it still lies on India. And this is not because of the territorial dispute between China and India, or that's not the most significant reason. I would argue that the most important reason for that design is that between China and India, there is a structural conflict between two great powers in the sub-region. So, in the Chinese perception, probably which is accurate, India sees South Asia as its own sphere of influence. And while China respects the fact that India is the largest power in the South Asia subcontinent, China does not accept the conclusion or the implication, the implied message that China's presence or China's existence in South Asia does not have legitimacy. And the most conspicuous statement that we heard from the Chinese diplomats, senior diplomats, if I remember correctly, was from this past January. The Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka made a public statement that China is also a South Asian country. So you would wonder that where's the logic? But regardless of the logic, I think the conclusion or the perception on the Chinese side is quite clear that China's presence in South Asia is legitimate, despite the fact that India is the largest power in the sub-region. So in the Xi Jinping era, we all know that starting from 2013, China started to emphasize that the periphery or the neighboring countries are the emphasis or the priority of the Chinese diplomacy, and apparently that includes India. And since then, we would argue that China also strengthened its attempt to cooperate with India on regional issues and especially on global issues. So we see the AIIB, we see the New Development Bank, we see other collaboration between China and India under the framework of South-South cooperation vis-a-vis the global north. But on the issue of the regional security architecture and the political relations, the conflict of interest between China and India remains to be the dominant theme. From the Chinese perspective, in South Asia sub-region, China's development of relations with other smaller countries in South Asia is out of the need to counterbalance India. And then, so there's this interesting division or the three different tiers of China's policy towards India. On the South Asia sub-region, China sees a need to counterbalance India, to develop relations with smaller countries in the sub-region. But then if you look at the whole Asia region, what the Chinese sees is an attempt or a possibility, a potential of India aligning its position with the United States and Japan and other democracies to counterbalance China. So how to prevent that from happening on the Asia regional level? To guard against this Indian tendency to align its position with the United States, most importantly, is China's priority. Then on the global level, as the largest developing countries, what the Chinese do see is a need or a demand or a possibility and very rich, fertile ground for China and India to cooperate together to counterbalance or to balance the developed countries. So those are the three levels of consideration in China's policy towards India on the sub-regional level, regional level, and on the global level. And we do see the conflicts among these three different levels of Chinese interest conflict with each other. So on the issue of the Indo-Pacific strategy, so it has been a year since the strategy was formally announced by President Trump during his visit to Asia last year. So in the Chinese observation, which is probably correct, that for a very long time there was not really a lot of substance to the Indo-Pacific strategy. So although the Chinese think tanks and the Chinese scholars have devoted a lot of time and resources to study Indo-Pacific strategy, at least up until this past summer, I don't think the Chinese have reached a conclusion that the Indo-Pacific strategy forms a imminent and a substantial threat to China's national interest. But that assessment is being adjusted and it definitely is evolving. And in comparison, at least in 2018, the most acute problem for China is how to deal with the U.S. China relations, how to deal with Trump administration's policy on China regarding trade, regarding the strategic issues. So in terms of the urgency and the level of challenge, since the issue of the Indo-Pacific strategy is not listed as China's top priority at this moment. When China looks at the Indo-Pacific strategy, the newest component to it for China is India, because U.S.-Japan alliance has been there forever, and the trilateral cooperation among U.S., Japan, and Australia has also been there for quite a long time. So those are not really new components. But then, like I mentioned, India's position, especially whether India will seek an alignment, or maybe not alliance, but alignment with the United States, is a core concern, is the most intriguing question for the Chinese. So far, the Chinese seems to have reached the conclusion that India wants to maintain its non-aligned position, maintain its strategic autonomy. And they also see that India's main goal is to build good relations with all countries, including with Russia. So those are perceived or quoted in China, in the Chinese policy community, as reasons that India will not seek alignment with the United States, where there are realistic constraints to that attempt. And especially after the Doklam incident last year, people were expecting some deterioration of relations between China and India. So what we see is that due to the deterioration of the relations between China and the United States, the alignment choice of India has become a critical factor for China's foreign policy, or for China's regional strategy. So at least at the minimum, China does not want to become that one party in the strategic triangle that's being counterbalanced by an alignment, by aligned U.S. and India. So what we see is that Doklam did not really bring on what we have not witnessed, and sustainable or ongoing damage to the Sino-India relations. And a key orientation of China's policy toward India this year is to repair the bilateral relations. And for the Chinese, Modi's visit to China in this past April, especially the Wuhan component, where he met with Xi Jinping, was seen as the most evident signs. And the Chinese also draw the conclusion from the Wuhan summit between Modi and Xi that Modi recommitted India's interest in the strategic autonomy and India's continued pursuit of a foreign policy of independence, of peaceful development. So the Chinese interpretation of that is that India, at least for now, will not seek an alliance that's aimed at containing China. And the further on message is that the Chinese believe that India will make a wise choice between U.S. and China in terms of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So what the Chinese have perceived are reassuring messages from India, but you have to wonder whether those perceptions have the Chinese bias embedded in it to begin with. So going a little bit more deeper, what is a fundamental problem between China and India, when China deals with India? I think there's a difference in terms of the expectation, and the difference in terms of the perception of the power status in the region. I agree with the ambassador when she said that China does have a hegemonic pursuit in the broader region, but for China, both China and India are pragmatists, and they are both realists. So for China, when they look at the South Asia sub-region or the Asia region in general, they see that the regional power structure has to be based on the power structure, has to be based on the power disparity. So in that sense, what I detect is that China fundamentally does not see India as China's peer, or not yet. So in that sense, I believe that India can use or exploit alignment choices internationally in its external relations to increase its weight in dealing with China, and which will be conducive to the enhancement of India's regional status. And from the Indian perspective, I think that is certainly a very sensible path forward. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We now go to Dan.
Great, thanks, Michael. It's great to be included in this panel. I wanted to start by commending the ambassador for her talk, and the two of us were lucky enough to see the paper upon which it's based ahead of time, so I was able to collect my thoughts a bit more. It's a comprehensive piece and quite valuable. I wanted to begin with a couple of observations based on that, and to observe that there are two inherent organizing principles that you identified that, and it's not clear to me that either one of these is necessarily the one that we should use, but I think they're worth thinking about a bit. The first of these is your distinction between Mackinder and Mahan, sort of the land-based power and the sea-based power, and whether, for instance, we should perceive China as increasingly a land-based or increasingly a sea-based power. And here in the United States, we tend to see ourselves certainly as a sea-based power, particularly in Asia, and how those two things match up. So that leads to a whole series of interesting questions as to how a land-based and a sea-based power can compete and are likely to compete, and whether they're likely to compete on different terms. So I'll just put that out there as one observation. And the second would be a different organizing principle, almost an entirely different organizing principle is more ideological. It is the autocracy versus democracy, or liberal versus illiberal organizing principle. And there, that line of thinking also runs through the ambassador's talk, and it's not clear that these things are necessarily incompatible, but I think they inform the nature of the competition that is emerging between the United States and China, and are useful framing devices, even if perhaps ultimately both of them are incomplete. Yun's comments also struck me as really useful, and one quick observation on those would be that this evolution of Chinese perceptions on India and her interpretation of it fits very squarely with my own, which is that, say, over the past decade, as I've had opportunities to go to China and speak with Chinese authorities and experts, it's been quite clear to me that their concerns about India have evolved and shifted fairly rapidly, but that they've evolved principally on the basis of the extent to which they perceive India as increasingly and maybe surprisingly aligned with the United States. And the principal shock in that evolution was the civil nuclear deal during the Bush administration, which from a Chinese perspective came out of nowhere and kind of upended decades of Indian sort of more strategic autonomy or non-aligned, to use an older terminology, perception of its own interests, and suggested that India was taking a new and very different path. And now I think it's quite right to see that China doesn't see India in its league at all, except with respect to where India is aligned with the United States. And that's what China is focused on. And that leads, I think, to a series of interesting questions about what China would pursue in the way of policies, because if its principal concern is not India per se, but India as India aligned with the United States, then wedge strategies, or trying to drive India from the United States, or seeking opportunities to peel India from the United States, become very important for Beijing. So, but let me leave that there. I did have a three-part set of comments of my own relating to these topics, and I'll try to be brief. But the first of these is, I'll call it the limits of Indian power. And I think this is a very important thing to keep in mind. The principal thing to recognize about India is that although the Trump administration and even the Obama administration before it have called India a risen power, it's not really quite there. And I think we're better off being realistic about this. And worse than it not being there, I have some qualms and concerns about whether India is in fact building the capacity or driving the kind of change that it would need internally to achieve that, say, great power status that many of our assumptions, at least in this town, are based on in terms of expectations about when India will be. And here I'm reminded just the other evening I had a dinner conversation with somebody who works at a major weapons manufacturing firm who was talking about India being very excited because India is looking for new fighter jets. And I just chuckled because when I worked at the State Department, this is now 2005 or so, the multi-role combat aircraft tender was something that was also very exciting, and 128 jets were something that U.S. manufacturers were salivating over. And now this is edging in on 15 years later, and India's ability to actually fulfill that order. Ultimately, there's a lot of heres and theres and ups and downs in this, but it's not yet there. Now, a country with the resources that India has that can't actually seal deals like this is a country we have to wonder about whether, when will that happen? When will India sort of find its way out of its own way? Now, the ambassador has made, I thought, a great line. She noted that India's national character, national morale, quality of diplomacy, military preparedness, and quality of government will determine India's success. And I would only just leave that as an open question. How do we judge all of these things? Now, of course, in relative terms, not every, all the countries we're talking about have governance issues, have national morale issues. Quality of democracy is certainly not, or sorry, of diplomacy is not something that's unique to India, but military preparedness, quality of government, efficiency of government, effectiveness of government, relative to China, I think we have some serious questions to raise. So that's the limits of Indian power. Then the limits of Chinese influence. Let's be clear. China, I think, is finding that it is not, and I think we are finding, that it is not as skillful or as smart as it is wealthy and now powerful, particularly when it comes to dealing with its neighborhood. And there are a lot of questions that are emerging in Beijing as well, not just here in the United States, about how good of a job China is doing at extending its influence without creating the very backlash that ultimately would cause it to be less influential rather than more influential. And here we can look to some of the recent news stories about Malaysia, or we can go back to some earlier stories about Myanmar, or as the ambassador pointed out, we can look at Sri Lanka. And the story in each case is that it's a mixed bag for China. China is, there are a lot of questions being raised about how China is actually managing its projection of influence, not just the fear of sort of a flood of Chinese cash and easily buying people off, but the actual reality of turning people off by being overly heavy-handed and attempting to project influence in ways that actually create what I might call antibodies to Chinese influence. Look at Australia and look at its internal debate over China's influence in its politics, and you'll see what I'm talking about in the way of antibodies. Now, these may not necessarily be a long-term final barrier to Chinese influence in the region. I'm not saying anything like that. It could be just a speed bump along the way to the extension of Chinese influence throughout the region. But China, as far as I understand, is in the midst of a sort of rethinking of the Belt and Road, not a rethinking that will lead it to disengage from the Belt and Road, but to rethink how it's going about it. And there's a question as to how that revision is likely to play out. And one can think of at least two major directions it might take. One of these, it might become a more transparent, market-driven approach, one that would be less likely to stir, I think, in many of these countries, the sorts of antibodies that I'm talking about. But that would accept limits to Chinese influence, because it couldn't just do what it wants to do. It couldn't just throw its money around and expect to buy people off. It would have to play by a series of market-based rules. A different approach would be to not accept those limits, and to take an even more coercive, or continue along the path of this coercive approach. But my expectation is that that would stir further antibodies, which in themselves would bring about limits. So either way you get limits, and this is not, the extension of Chinese influence is not a simple thing, and it's not unfolding neatly. Last point, the limits of American policy. So the United States does, unlike India, have a fair amount of power and capability, and unlike India, and unlike China, already enjoys a great deal of influence throughout the region. But our policy is seriously limited. And I will say we're used to being a superpower. And as a quick aside, I did spend a couple of years working at the State Department. And what counted as a strategy for the State Department at the time too often was effectively us saying, what is it that we want? Now let's go tell somebody else what we want, and they'll give it to us. Because we're a superpower. Well, that's not a strategy, and it's certainly not a strategy, beyond rhetoric. Sometimes it works, particularly when the power is so overwhelming that the other side feels intimidated. But we're finding ourselves in a position where that's less and less the case, particularly when we're dealing in sort of a competitive environment with China. So, of course, we have to be more surgical, more precise. If we simultaneously intend to push China in ways that will bring it to do less of what we don't want, and also pull our allies and friends along with us, We're having a lot of trouble with that. We cannot be picking fights with everybody all at the same time. And I think that's what we're in the midst of right now. We need to develop a series of policy tools that do not assume that other states need us more than we need them. That is not the case in much of this region. And they also we cannot assume that other countries need us more than they need China. Another problem that we haven't had so much before. We do not have the luxury of relying on our wealth or our military power in ways that we maybe could decades ago. And a last point, we can also not assume that countries in this region, even more liberal countries, will appreciate our profession of liberal values and democracy in ways that may have been historically the case. They may not accept that we are principally driven by values or ideals in the way that we once I think, could make a stronger case. So that puts us in a tougher bind, and I think, once again, imposes limits on our policy. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thanks to Dan and Yun for two excellent set of comments following Ambassador Rao's excellent presentation. So I think we've set the stage for a very useful discussion. I wanted to put two questions to the panel before we open things up. One of them relates to others. One can easily ask the question of how does country X, Y, or Z fit into this story of the U.S., India, China situation. And I'll choose one country, and that's Russia. We heard a little bit about Russia over the last hour, but not that much about it. Russia, of course, is a power in its own right. It has a very rocky relationship with the U.S. It continues to have rock-solid relations with India, and at this point, a fairly solid relationship with China. Its relations with Pakistan are also growing to an extent. So I don't know if any one of you wanted to talk about how Moscow and its policies may affect or play into this triangle, or in other words, if the triangle were to become some type of four-sided shape, what would it look like? So that's the first question. The second question, we've talked about some of the frictions at play and troubles between the U.S. and India, China and India. Are there areas where the three countries can marshal their collective resources and cooperate in a big way? So in my mind, Afghanistan comes to mind right away. It's a country where the U.S. and India and China all want it to be a more stable and peaceful and prosperous place. And I was very struck that in the Wuhan summit that was referred to, the Indian and Chinese leaders pledged to work together in Afghanistan. Not the first time that pledge has been made, but there were some specific pledges to work together on connectivity projects in Afghanistan. Very striking. So can the three sides find ways to work together in Afghanistan, or are there other examples that can perhaps be brought to the table? So I open that up to the panel. Whoever would like to go first, please. Ambassador Rao?
The question about Russia being possibly the fourth part of the,
Yeah.
or a kind of an adjunct, let's say, to the triangle. I don't think that has been conceptualized in any way by our foreign policy movers and shakers. India's relationship with Russia has been pursued on another radial, as it were. The relationship, if you ask any Indian policymaker, he or she would say is still important. Perhaps in some ways it's lost its heart, something like that character in The Wizard of Oz, I think, searching for its heart. But the fact is that the leaders meet, and there is still a component of the relationship which is related to defense acquisitions and servicing and that kind of collaboration that has been maintained, some scientific and technical collaboration, but it's a much attenuated relationship compared to what it was in the past. And referring to Mackinder and Mahan, to what extent is Russia a sea-based power today? It never was in the Indian Ocean by any definition, but today even less. So I think the primary focus of concern and attention would really be the China-India US and add Japan and Australia and the ASEAN countries. I think that is how this whole definition of an Asia that we are looking at today could be constructed. And as far as cooperation between India and China and the United States, looking at what we might do, I think, as you rightly said, Afghanistan is a good place to start from. And now, of course, we have these talks just concluded in Moscow, where even the Taliban were included in this sort of mixture of what could and might happen there. It's still a very fluid and a difficult to define situation in Afghanistan. And we keep talking about Afghan-led and Afghan, determined. We'll have to see how far the Taliban plays in that game. They're certainly playing for very high stakes, and they have their backers. And so it's very difficult to really create a kind of a viable and a credible prognosis for what might happen in that country. But yes, I think there's much scope for India, China, and the United States to do more in Afghanistan together for the good of that country. In fact, already India and China are cooperating in the training of diplomats, I understand, Afghan diplomats. A small beginning, not perhaps so ambitious, but still, I think we have to start small, but think big.
Yes, Yun and Dan?
I'll go for it. Thank you. On the issue of Russia, well, the partnership between China and Russia is defined as strategic coordinative partnership. So that's different from strategic cooperative. So the implied message is that on the issue related to the United States or on the issue related to the regional issues, that China and Russia coordinate that position. So that we do see that manifesting itself in terms of the East China Sea, in terms of the South China Sea. And now that China and Russia, they are pursuing the Polar Silk Road as well. We'll see how much products that comes out of that relationship. But coming to a quadrilateral or like a four-party emergence of a framework, I don't see that yet. I see trilateral, a triangle, for example, U.S., China, Russia, the strategic triangle argument from Dr. Kissinger, and then the perception of a triangle among U.S., China, and India, but I don't see these two as yet mingled together. Then on specific issues such as Russian arms sales to India, I think the Chinese have the tendency to use those arms sales as beating sticks to pose questions to the United States. So, for example, PLA General was put on U.S. sanction because of the S-400 sales to China, and the Chinese are asking the question that, what is going to happen to India? So I think there are those arguments. Then on the issue of Afghanistan, I think for the Chinese, the key question is Pakistan. And I think that will bring into the game a lot of irreconcilable positions. And I think that's, at least within China, there are a lot of resistance or negative perceptions about negative feelings about working with India, because I think the assumption in the Chinese foreign policy community, or when they look at Afghanistan, is that India's position or India's eventual end game is going to be different from that of Pakistan, and therefore slightly different from what China would like to see. So I think the Pakistan factor will be a key factor in that consideration. Then in terms of cooperation. So the ambassador mentioned that the collaboration on the training of the Afghan diplomats, and it reminds me of the U.S.-China cooperation on conflict issues as well. So there have been almost more than a decade that calling for U.S. and China to work on Afghanistan, to work on conflict issues. And indeed, I think starting from more than 10 years ago, maybe not, well, around 2010, there was the joint training program of Afghan diplomats. So it seems the joint training of Afghan diplomats is a great way to go. And what has happened is that the Chinese side and the American side select the Afghan diplomats and place them in Beijing at the Foreign Affairs College, which is the diplomatic academy of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, for a month or 2 months for training, and then bring them here to the United States for training as well. So I've heard mixed reviews about that program. So the comment from the observers seems to be that if you just want symbolic examples of, yes, US and China are working together on some issues related to the future of Afghanistan, that is a great example. But if you look at the substance, to what extent those cooperation really improves the future or improves the peace process in Afghanistan, I think that maybe that's too ambitious to ask to begin with.
In fact, may I just button here and ask you to just elaborate a little more about the negative feelings you mentioned within the Chinese policy establishment or the people who deal with the possibilities of cooperation in Afghanistan? Is that what you meant about how India and Pakistan relate to each other and what that might mean for the outcomes?
I'm sure Dan knows much more about this than I do. And in fact, Dan just hosted a dialogue with the Chinese side on the strategic evolution in South Asia. What I have observed is a competitive relationship in the between China, perception of competition between China and Pakistan, maybe on the same side, India on the other side, within the domestic politics of Afghanistan. And what they perceive is that India has its, well, what the Chinese would call India has its own proxies in the Afghan domestic politics that are pro-Indian and are more likely to bring in Indian influence and Indian interest into Afghanistan's future. And those interests and those alignment may not be perceived as fully in line with what the Chinese see as the future Afghanistan that's in China's interest.
I see. I'm quite intrigued by that because it's the first time, I've really looked at it from the point of view that you're expressing. Because I, at least in my years of looking at Afghanistan, I never came across this kind of conceptualization that China's interests in Afghanistan may be more closely allied with Pakistan's than with the rest, as it were. And India is probably on the side of the rest, because what kind of involvement do we have in Afghanistan, India at the moment? It's basically development cooperation. It's dealing with the Afghan people, basically. We don't have too much of any kind of security relationship, really, with Afghanistan. We've kept it very low. We've kept it very understated. And perhaps it doesn't really, the potential hasn't really been fully established. So I would think that there are no fundamental contradictions between India and China in Afghanistan, except if you were to bring in the Pakistan factor.
Of course. Dan?
Just really briefly, I'd say that's a huge accept. And it's the accept. And it's, my read of Indian policy, and I wouldn't presume to know more or say more about it, but only to suggest that many times the Indian perspective on Afghanistan is deeply, deeply skeptical about what is being called reconciliation or bringing the Taliban back in a sense, in ways that, of course, that's almost at the core of the China-Pakistan project. To the extent that China is being brought into a dialogue, it is in part with the intention of reconciling with the Taliban. So there's something pretty fundamentally at odds there. I'd only make a quick observation about the Russia angle, beginning by saying that I'm not no Russia hand. I've been there a few times over the past couple of years, and when you go to a country like Russia, when I go, I assume that I will meet lots of people, and that they really won't be thinking about the United States. I mean, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as the center of everybody else's concern around the world, and of course that's what they wake up being worried about. And so I went to Russia thinking that when I got there I would find that they really care a lot less about us than I might have thought. I was actually shocked to the other extreme, which is to say, so many Russians that I encountered, and they were inclined to suggest that they weren't alone, are obsessed with the United States and obsessed strategically with their concerns about relations with the West, to begin with the United States, but not end there. So if the strategic perception from Moscow is one in which concerns about the West are driving most things, then that informs, I think in many ways, Russia's view of China. which is to say China is a secondary order issue because the principal and overriding concern is how to deal with the West on issues like Ukraine and everything else. So now this is interesting because in many ways, some of my other research is suggesting that China is eating Russia's lunch in Central Asia. And really, pushing its advantage in some in really interesting ways in which if Russia were less concerned about the West, it would be a lot more concerned about what's happening in the East. But it doesn't have the luxury to be concerned about that because it's just so fixated. And so I think, that's an interesting, one day, one way or another, Russia will wake up. And whether that from this particular concern about the West or focus on the West, and it will see what's happening. And then I don't know whether that will be too late for them to do much about what China is up to or not. I think that's a timing issue.
In fact, if I may also just interject here, when Dan spoke about the Taliban, and I think India's own position on the Taliban seems to be evolving, because I remember a stage when the then Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh said, to talk of good and bad Taliban was like talking, it's an oxymoron, he said. And they were all bad. And essentially that's how India saw how dealing with the Taliban was concerned. And then you go, move fast forward to 2010 and, at one of the Afghanistan meetings where India sort of seemed to sort of nuance its position on the Taliban, saying that every party concerned should be involved, and drew certain red lines for Taliban participation about, subscribing to the Constitution of Afghanistan, the unity of Afghanistan, etc. But in the recent conference in Moscow that happened a few days ago, India actually sent 2 retired diplomats to participate in the discussions. One was the former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan, and the other was the former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan, and who had also headed the Afghanistan desk in the foreign ministry. So they were not just retired diplomats, they obviously had the trust of the establishment. So in a sense, I think what this expresses is that India is invested in the process, and that's really how observers in India look at it, and it wants to be a part of the talks, even if it's just an observer at the moment.
And of course, one reason why India's now come on board is this full recognition that there's really no other way for this war to end. Even though it's going to be very hard to end the war through talks, winning the war militarily is not an option.
And we didn't talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where, of course, India and China and Russia are all involved. And
absolutely.
Pakistan, too.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example of regional cooperation. Well, let's go to all of you. I'll call on you, and please wait until you have a microphone in front of you before you pose your question, because all the people watching and listening via the live stream around the world, they wouldn't be able to hear you ask your question if you didn't have a mic. Please keep it to one question as well, so that we can get as many as we can. So we'll start in the back. David, right in front of you, Rahul. Yep.
Thanks. I want to appreciate, Michael, this forum, which I think is really timely, and some really brilliant commentary by all 3 of your guests. My question is really for Ambassador Rao, and it goes to the issues of power, and it's a little bit tactical, but I think it probably goes close to your heart. In order to be powerful, you have to have a strong diplomatic corps. A few years ago, people told me that India's diplomatic corps was about the size of a middle-sized European countries. It had less people working on the U.S. than Singapore. And I've been very impressed over the years with the quality of the Chinese diplomatic corps and the effort they put into that. So can India be a power without a much bigger, stronger diplomatic corps?
The short answer is no. I'm convinced that we do need a much stronger, bigger diplomatic corps, foreign service. And we are certainly moving in that direction, but I think some fundamental reforms are needed within the Indian establishment of how we recruit our diplomats, the kind of structures of the examinations that are involved, the kind of talent pool that we're looking at, because the whole face of India is changing. 45 years ago, when I joined the Foreign Service, we were essentially drawn from the metropolitan cities. None of us came from small towns. I was the only person in that cohort who didn't come from Delhi or Bombay or Chennai or Calcutta. But the thing is completely changed today. And most of the people entering the civil services, because it's one, sort of one examination that recruits for all the civil services, including the foreign service. Many of them who are entering these services are doctors and engineers. They're not from the liberal arts. They're not people who've studied the humanities. Very few lawyers. So I think we need some kind of real introspection about how we are recruiting our people, our talent, how we sort of nurture this talent. Many of them having studied in very small towns and cities, they have a good education, but many of them don't speak an international language like English, for instance. So how do you school these people? I think we need a much longer period of preparation for young potential entrants into diplomatic service. It's not at all like how it was in the immediate post-independence era. And certainly we need more numbers. But resources are often a constraint. As India grows richer and more prosperous, that will be less of a constraint. But if you look at the strength of the civil services in India, all across the board, I'm looking at even law enforcement and everything, we are very, very short-staffed. It's not just the diplomatic service.
Okay, a question up here in the front.
My name is Michael Yehuda. I'm currently a visiting scholar at George Washington University. My question is about China. It seems that not only is there a growing sort of trade conflict between the United States and China, it seems almost as if the United States is mounting a much more serious challenge to China than just about trade. And this is occurring at a time in which China is facing a whole number of serious challenges, partly from within. The economic system that it has right now is not working as it did in the past, and there are much of the trade system which they have is really dependent on contributions from outside investment, outside companies, and so on. So, in that sense, is there, I suppose the question really is, how deep is the crisis that China is facing? Because I think that will change the whole pattern of relations.
Good question. Did you want to take a stab, Jan?
Sure, I'll stab it. How serious a challenge? I think it depends on the context, right? So if you okay, let me put it this way. So when the Chinese compare the strengths and the weakness for them in this trade war with the United States, and then they compare the U.S. weaknesses and strengths, then I think they draw a relatively, I would say not relatively, a rather different conclusion from what observers here might draw, because the Chinese assessment is that by the end of the day, we are not a democratic system. Our government's decision is not necessarily subject to the public opinion. It's not subject to the votes of the voters. So there are quite a few people in China, well, not a few people, I would say even the majority of the government officials would like to believe that is a strength of the Chinese system, that adds to the resilience of the Chinese ability to weather this trade war with the United States. And in addition, well, with the constitutional revision this past spring, Xi Jinping removed the term limits on his position, which means that the consistency of the Chinese policy, of the Chinese government's policy, is much higher than compared to the United States. So I would say yes. If you look at the bad debt problem, the capital outflow, the fleeing out of the Chinese market, and look at the problem that the Chinese economy has run into, and on top of that, put in the impact of the U.S. trade war with the United States, I think most of us would draw a very, very gloomy conclusion about where China is. However, I would say that when you are in China, when you are looking at this problem from the inside of the system perspective, you draw a different conclusion. You look at the cards that you have and look at the policy consistency that you can afford and look at the public opinion that you can control. I think their conclusion is very different from ours.
Yes, gentleman with the blue sweater.
Ambassador Rao, thank you so much. I'm really happy that you talked about Mackinder and Heartland, and if you keep making this presentation, Robert Kaplan may be out of a job. My question is about optics. Back in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles did everything he could to get Nehru and India into the Cold War, into our side, and I think a lot of at the time, that was probably the logical choice, but they wanted non-alignment. They wanted to do their own thing. And with our Indo-Pacific strategy now, how can the U.S. engage with India in the strategy vis-a-vis China without these issues of being belittling or being a pawn in another game of empire?
I think at the popular level in India, when you talk about the United States and you talk about America, as it's called, I think there is a lot of acceptance at the popular level of what the United States stands for and how Indians relate to the United States. And secondly, we have the huge Indian-American diaspora here, which has been so successful, so visible, and has been such a positive factor in building bridges between the two countries. So that's very different from the 50s also. And the BJP, the government, the party in power today, has traditionally been America-friendly. Going back to the 50s, to the forerunners of the BJP, the ancestral line of the BJP. If you look at politicians who today would probably not be in the Congress but in the BJP, if there had been these two parties, this party existing at that time, there was a pro-American school of thought even at that time in the highest policy-making levels of government. It's just that Nehru, being the kind of leader who towered above everybody else, decided on that route of non-alignment, and he was perhaps, I think, under the historical circumstances, if you look at where India was at that time, newly independent, with a great degree of challenges facing it internally, particularly just the consolidation of nationhood being what it was, the enormity of that task. I think it made sense for Nehru not to be involved in either side in the Cold War. That's what he wanted, and that's how non-alignment and peaceful coexistence, as the Chinese and Indians, in fact, defined it for the first time, was meant to be. Nehru really wanted India to be that third force, as it were, in global politics. Today, of course, things are so different. None of those situations really apply. So between India and the United States, I think, the breakdown of all those attitudes has really happened as far as India is concerned. And you've seen the partnership grow as a result, where we are today compared to where we were 15 years ago. There's so much more of a richness in the texture of our relations with the United States. And I don't see it sort of decelerating or regressing. And I see progressive betterment in this relationship. And when President Trump came to power, people raised the question, where will the relationship be headed, and is there uncertainty? But I wouldn't say there is uncertainty in that sense of the word in our relationship, especially the military and strategic aspect of it, which you just spoke of, I think is in a very good place today. Perhaps India needs to be a little more venturesome, to put it bluntly, in defining where this relationship goes in terms of interoperability, for instance, and in terms of working more closely together in the Quad, as I spoke of, and looking at how we expand our military and strategic cooperation with the democracies. And talking of democracy, one aspect of Chinese presence in our region is how it brings up this whole kind of contradiction between democracy and autocracy. And I think it's very, very palpable now when you look at Sri Lanka, when you look at Maldives, when you, of course, Pakistan is very different. There's an established way of, how they do things there. But the fact is, in Sri Lanka, at least the tea leaves, or at least the media reports that come out would suggest that China backs a certain kind of leadership. It's happened in the Maldives, in the execution of the Belt and Road projects, and you talked about the MMRCA deal and why no business gets done with India. That's the other end of the spectrum, because everything is questioned in India. Every deal that we do gets dissected in Parliament. The media comes up with something. So in a sense, we have this stasis as a result. How do we get out of it is the question. And I hope things will change. There's much more kind of effort to bring transparency into these workings happening. And I think Mr. Modi's whole project, the Digital India project, and how we sort of remove middlemen and how we do these things more openly and more transparently, I hope will bring a change.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, just I would reiterate this point that the ambassador just made about this remarkable trajectory over the past 15 years in U.S.-India relations. This is the change over that time really shouldn't be underestimated. At the same time, the question had to do in part with how the United States should best manage this relationship going forward and what it should avoid doing. And at the core of this is where the United States should set its level of expectations for this bilateral relationship. And I think where we've found ourselves frustrated is when we assume that India should or will do anything other than pursue its interests, and that at some level those interests might we should recognize that at some level those interests, as the ambassador was just pointing out, are aligned with ours when it comes particularly to China and to sort of some basic questions about global order or about democracy versus non-democracy and so on. So that's a real positive. But where we come into trouble is where we begin to believe or hope or expect that India will carry U.S. water and will kind of toe the U.S. line on a variety of other policy issues that are of significant importance to the United States, but not so much to India. And we're always disappointed on these things. So whether it's Iran or Russia or otherwise, that's where we find ourselves at odds. And so India won't do what we want to show its love for us. It's just not going to happen. And so as long, so we shouldn't expect that, I guess would be the point. That's where we find ourselves getting in trouble. If we're okay with that, and if we can kind of bring our level of popular, public, and political expectations in line with that, then I think we've got a pretty good story over the long term. But if we keep bumping up against that, then we have troubles.
Let's take one more question from this side of the room, and then we'll come over to the other side of the room. So, yes, you, please.
Thank you. So a relatively recent UN climate report has said that we have essentially very little time to make very drastic changes to avert a climate change disaster on a global level. And I think in an ideal world, this U.S., China, India triangle could lead the way in addressing climate change. But I'm wondering what the prospects are in the real world for this triangle to address climate change going forward.
I think that the U.S. may be the weak link these days when it comes to that question. I don't know if anyone wanted to respond to that. No? Okay.
I obviously agree with what you've said. I think that there has to be more cooperation. I think between India and China, I don't think there are any fundamental disagreements when it comes to, how we tackle the issue of climate change, and linking it, of course, to the overarching priority of development, which is what I think we need for that part of the world. But we've learned a lot of good practices from the United States in the past. I mean, this whole thing about renewable energy research and scientific development of new technologies. It's not as if that connection has been devoid of benefit for us when we look at the long term. But I think today, under Mr. Modi, one of the great successes has been the utilization of new sources of renewable energy for our power requirements, electricity and power requirements, energy requirements within the country. And I think that trajectory has been one of the great successes for this current administration.
And to bookend that, I've been struck that for all one hears about the Trump administration's lack of enthusiasm about clean energy issues, some of these joint statements to come out of these meetings between high-level Indian and U.S. officials, there is talk about, at least in writing, about clean energy cooperation. So that says something. Okay, so let's come to this side of the room. I'll start all the way in the back, gentlemen, right there. Yep.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about more the larger role of the international community. We've been talking a lot about multilateral and bilateral regional agreements in Asia, but is there a role to play for the India and the U.S. international allies, and more specifically European powers such as France and Germany or the UK, to play a role either leveraging with China economically and stuff like that?
Please.
I think there's definitely a scope for doing more. There are no fundamental misalignments or disagreements between the countries that you spoke of and India, and certainly not with the US. There are, of course, minor sort of disturbances that happen, as over the last few days, in terms of, what the social media would indicate. But I think in fundamental terms, why not? And there should be much more. And I think in the Indo-Pacific, all these countries, do have a stake in terms of seeing how we ensure freedom and openness. So there is scope, definitely, for more collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Just coming back to, we talked, I mentioned at the outset how taken I was with some of these organizing principles, heartland, rimland, democracy, autocracy. So where does Europe fit into this? Well, to some extent, it depends on how you are interpreting what the kind of the proper organizing principle or the most correct, most appropriate organizing principle of the world is going forward. And if it's liberal versus illiberal, then of course our Western European friends are at the core of that project, and any U.S. competition with China would have to include them, and not just include them, but would see them as central. If it's more of a heartland, rimland, convergence of interests having to do more with economic connectivity and so on, well, there the story is different. You're seeing all kinds of connections across continental Eurasia that could potentially bring China more in line with some of our European friends rather than less so. It's a very different storyline. So, which is to say, I don't have an answer, but it really depends on which kind of organizing principle you subscribe to as to how you begin to get that answer.
Yeah, I should say outside of the government space, speaking about institutional issues here, you have a number of research organizations out there, like the German Marshall Fund, that are increasingly bringing together Americans and Europeans and Indians and Chinese to participate in these talk shops, which are interesting. Some of us may have participated in them, so I think that says something about the role of Europe. So let's go here. There was a question. Yes, with the white shirt.
Thank you. My name is Yuan Fei, and I'm a student at the Washington Semester Program of American University. This is a question to Ambassador. When we're talking about India as a democratic country, because I have a lot of experience with Nepali students, and then they talk a lot about the 2015 Nepal blockade, that thinking that India is acting like a regional bully to those small countries. And my question is that, does India have a mindset that considers itself as a legal successor of all the former colonial territories? And then how would the small countries in the region treat the rise of India?
Well, I shall talk from the perspective of the big country, India. I certainly, I mean, since I worked in the foreign policy sector for many years, I certainly didn't look at the relationship with our neighbors as a big country versus small country kind of definition of terms, as it were. I think with Nepal, and I know what our Nepalese friends say about relations with India, and I think they have their perspective about dealing with the giant next door. But the fact is, this relationship between India and Nepal is so organically intertwined. I mean, you have an open border between the two countries. You have 5 million or so, or it's not really counted, Nepalese legally working in India, and many more, who cross the border, especially in our northeast, for instance. We have huge numbers of Nepalese. You look at the population of Sikkim, which is one of the states of India in the northeast. It is much of the majority of population there is of Nepalese origin, or what call themselves Nepalese. In fact, the whole outward migration of Nepalese out of Nepal into India and surrounding areas has, if you go into northern Myanmar, there are hundreds of thousands of Nepalese there, and now it stretches down even to Thailand. So that is really the way Nepalese have in a sense been free to move, and the force of gravity really pushes them southward into India. It's not into China or across the mountains. As far as their feelings about big country India bullying them, and I think these feelings, yes, they do exist. We don't deny that. And objectively speaking, we have to deal with these issues. There's some degree of reassurance has to be provided to the Nepalese. In any relationship, I think each side has to think that the other side is treating them fairly. And if the Nepalese feel that there are some gaps and some shortcomings as far as India is concerned, India should be prepared to address them. And I think as far as the so-called blockade of 2015 was concerned, it had a lot to do with the passage of the Nepalese constitution, the new constitution, and the perception among certain sections of the Nepalese population, especially in the plains, not in the hill areas, because Nepal, as you know, has hilly areas and it has plains areas adjoining India. So these plains areas, the Tarai as it's called, adjoining India, and as I said, it's a very porous area. People move back and forth. And obviously there was a lot of disaffection among the plains people of Nepal about the way the new constitution was about to give or not give them power and responsibility. So the agitation began like that. And then it began a kind of stoppage of vehicles, any kind of movement from India, especially carrying goods and whatever was needed for the population into Nepalese territory. So what started off like as a people's agitation, which became increasingly strong and serious, then became this stoppage of entry and movement of Indian goods into Nepal. Whether it was a blockade in the traditional sense of the word, I really cannot say. I don't think it was actively any policy of the Indian government to block goods going into Nepal, because just after the earthquake, when India had been the first responder to help Nepal, it would seem a little contradictory that, a few weeks and months later, we were on the other side preventing things from entering Nepal. So the picture is not so clear.
Okay. Take a question right there, gentleman with the blue shirt. There are several gentlemen wearing blue shirts, but yeah, there, please.
Thanks. My question just concerns how the strategic triangle impacts the situation in Kashmir. How does does the United States have a particular impact as part of this triangle with the situation in Kashmir, and how does the relationship between India and China impact that? Just, I guess, for anybody who wants to answer.
I'm actually writing a book currently on the relationship between India and China from 1949 to 1962. And in the process of that work on my book, I have looking at some of the archives in the British Foreign Office. There was a report from Delhi, from the UK High Commission or Embassy, as you would know it, to London, saying that they had heard from the Indian Foreign Office that the Chinese envoy in Delhi, at that time, this was before 1949, actually around 1947-48, when you had a nationalist, Kuomintang, ambassador in Delhi, coming to the Chinese Foreign Office and asking, why can't you allow the Chinese to establish a consulate in Srinagar? That's the capital of Kashmir, the capital city of Kashmir. And today, I mean, it seems so unbelievable that at one stage, you know, this could have even been asked of us. The fact is that today, if you look at the state of Jammu and Kashmir as a whole, you have one portion of territory which is under the occupation, or we say, the Pakistanis would differ with that, of Pakistan. And we have a territory that forms the Indian-administered section of Kashmir, which we call the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And then you have territory which is about 14,000 square miles or so in the eastern part of the state, which is high and mountainous and very difficult in terms of accessibility, what we call the Aksai Chin. It's a part of the section of Kashmir which is called Ladakh, which looks very much like Tibet. That is under Chinese control. So actually you have three, you know, trisections to this whole question of Kashmir today. And where do we go from here is the question. I mean, it's the problem between India and Pakistan is 70 years old. The problem between India and China is more than 60, a little over 60 years old. So, you know, it seems to be that at the moment, no solution is in sight. And we've had to just deal with reality, compounded upon reality, compounded upon reality.
So the question at the front here, sir. Yeah, all the way at the front. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'm John Rogers. I'm a federal judge. I have a question that relates to the last question, which is, how are the relations between Pakistan and India now? Are they friendlier or getting friendly or more hostile, getting more hostile? I'm just unaware, but I wonder, in the dealing with those differences, I wonder whether China is trying to use its whether India is trying to use its connections with China or with the United States to affect its position with respect to those differences.
I don't think India is in any way actively looking at involving the US or China in trying to reduce differences with Pakistan. Where are the relations between India and Pakistan today? I think in the same place, I think, as they have been for so many years now. You know, sometimes you think things are warming up, at least warming up in the good sense, you know, that they're talking to each other and, you know, their leaders are meeting. And a few weeks later, it's followed up with something that has gone wrong, terribly wrong. So it's like a blood feud, I think, when members of a family have fallen out with each other, like the Montagues and the Capulets.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a couple of things on Kashmir, just observations more than anything else. But you know, from my perspective, when India looks at Kashmir, it does see it in the context of an internal concern, politics and security internal to India, as well as an external. But the external concern is with regard to Pakistan, not typically with regard to China. And one of the questions I have is whether that might be changing over time. Because, as the ambassador pointed out, parts of Kashmir actually have a bearing on the India-China relationship more than anything else. And from a few scattered conversations I've had with people from that part of Kashmir, they are concerned about increasing Chinese influence in a variety of ways that I think would be of concern to New Delhi, but I haven't yet seen that play out. So I'd wonder about that. The other, with respect to Pakistan and India, from a Washington perspective, there's this perennial question about whether we should get more involved in Kashmir. And the answer from New Delhi, for as long as I can remember, is no, stay as far out of this as you possibly can. There's zero interest on the Indian side to seeing us more involved. And that would only be magnified tenfold to the question of whether China should be more involved, because India would see that as even less possible. So in a simple sense, I think you can put it up to India is not happy with the status quo, but not eager to see anybody with good intentions or otherwise get more involved and attempt to push India towards some settlement or some set of conversations with Pakistan that wouldn't serve its purposes.
In fact, sorry, please go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. No, I think on Kashmir, I'm just thinking, I don't know if there's been any serving U.S. ambassador who's recently been to Kashmir, but I don't see any kind of fundamental opposition to any visit like that happening. I don't believe there would be. But it's very interesting that Chinese ambassadors, envoys to India, have never set foot in Kashmir, never at all. They've never sought even permission to go to that part of India. They go all to other places, not so much to our northeast, of course, and they have never been to Kashmir, and I don't believe they want to go. In old days, Kashmir was in many ways our corridor to Central Asia. And today that connection has been lost completely. It's been severed. It's really whatever connections exist between that part of the region exists between Pakistan and Xinjiang. But India had very strong connections with Xinjiang in the past, especially the region of Ladakh, which I spoke of, where there was an active trade, cross-Karakoram trade between India and Xinjiang. And it seems to me like when the Chinese speak of CPEC and connections through Pakistan to the Arabian Sea, to Gwadar, there's never been any talk of alternative alignments, despite the fact that disputes exist and sovereignties are contested. There's never ever been talk, for instance, of air links between Delhi and Srinagar and Urumqi, for instance, where you don't go across contested borders, but at least you have some links that enable people-to-people connectivity. These are really, this should really form part of what I call a Hindu Kush, Karakoram, Himalayan consensus that involves all the countries in the region, where you cooperate on climate change, where you cooperate on connectivity, cross-border trade, people-to-people, just opening up to each other.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
I agree with the ambassador. I think the accessing problem is quite critical for the Chinese calculation, not only because of the territorial dispute nature of it, but also because accessing also represents quite a critical transportation gateway for China that has an impact over both Tibet and Xinjiang. And I would say that when China looks at CPEC and look at the development of Xinjiang, the Chinese government would like for it to happen in a controlled manner. So it's through channels and through countries that China has more of a confidence that such opening up is not going to introduce more or further destabilizing factor into the region. So I think that's part of the consideration. And between the axes, the eastern side of the territorial dispute and the western side of the territorial disputes, there used to be a chance to have some sort of deal, but now that chance does not stand anymore. Coming to the Chinese CPEC projects through the disputed area, I think there is, to be honest, I think there's a level of hypocrisy on the Chinese side. That if you look at how China basically stopped foreign investors from collaborating with, for example, the Vietnamese government on a joint exploration in the South China Sea because the disputed nature of that part of the maritime domain, then you would question that what is the wisdom or what is the logic or what is the justification for China to pursue a similar policy through Kashmir. But then for China as to play a role between India and Pakistan, I have this argument that China's position between India and Pakistan is not neutral, but it can be objective. But for that objectivity to come out, it really needs to bring out almost a crisis scenario that for China to realize that the cost of not managing the crisis is going to significantly outweigh the cost of to be imposed on China-Pakistan Pakistan relations. So yeah, when there's a crisis, China usually would step in, and especially depending on how the crisis happened. The Chinese does put pressure on the Pakistani side, but it almost requires a crisis scenario for that objective position to come into play.
Yeah, I think on the India-Pakistan thing, it's essentially a stalemate, at least for the near term. Each side essentially thinks that the other side's leadership is not a credible partner and isn't worth talking to. And of course, India, correct me if I'm wrong, Ambassador Rao, I mean, as I understand it, India's current government really worries that any effort on the part of Pakistan to extend an olive branch would really be meant to open up the Kashmir issue, which the current government in India is not particularly inclined to discuss at all, because it thinks it's a resolved, the matter is resolved. So we had a question on this side of the room. I know you had your hand up, but so let's go to you.
Thank you. My name is Mutaya Alagapa. I'm from American University. My question is really not so much, you've been speaking about India and China as given political entities, but India has only been united historically 2 or 3 times in its history. And China too today is trying to build a nation, trying to make a multi-nation into a Han Chinese nation. And so there are conflicts within the countries. So how long do you think India will last as a unified country, and how long do you think China will last as a unified country? Thank you.
Anyone want to take that?
We in India believe in many reincarnations, many lives, but we'll remain India.
Yeah, and go ahead. I was going to say the Chinese Communist Party believes in only one reincarnation, and that's the one that's currently there, and it will last forever.
But on the Chinese kind of creation of the history to back up that narrative, that's a very active project right now, to suggest that the history of China has been one in which the roughly similar borders and an identity that is kind of constant across that period has persisted. And so that's not a history, an objective historical telling, at least not according to most of the sort of historians that we would come across, and certainly not in the West. But yet it's essential to the current narrative. And it's a Communist Party agenda to make it clear that Xinjiang and Tibet and so on have been a part and were always a part, more or less, of China, and that's something eternal. But it's not true. And I think it is important for us to recognize that as the history, but not to maybe go so far as you are trying to go, to suggest that therefore an unraveling is in the works. It's not. The politics also of coercion are very strong.
So we've got time for one more question, and it'll be right up here. Yep.
My mind is going to the question of the Taliban and the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the role that they may play in Chinese fear about Islamic fundamentalism, but also we've just seen a Wilson Center book on fundamentalist Muslims in India. So I'm wondering, to what extent does the threat or the possibility of threat of Taliban coming out of Pakistan and or Afghanistan have on the ability of India and China to work together on Afghanistan, or if there are fundamental concerns about fundamentalism that are driving cooperation instead? Thank you.
I think our problem, I'm talking of India and China together, is that perhaps much more could be happening. We spoke of Afghanistan, and we spoke of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism. India and China really don't work together in a sense to understand each other's perspectives on this issue. There are some no-go areas, it seems, although we speak of counterterrorism cooperation and all that. And that's why I mentioned Xinjiang, given the fact that China has certain concerns and and they're being played out. I mean, you see it in the media and other things. Why doesn't it look at, I would say a progressive country like India when it comes to managing diversity and many religions? And when you look at the kind of, if you have to establish a hologram for Islam in South Asia, why don't you look at the Indian hologram? I mean, you look at Islam. I mean, I haven't seen the book that you referred to about Islamic fundamentalism in India, but by and large, the Muslims of India is the second largest population of Muslims anywhere in the world after Indonesia. And they have lived in peace with the rest of the population, and they are not known. I mean, you've had pockets of communalism and extremism happening from time to time, but by and large they're integrated with the rest of the population, and you've had a fairly peaceful, stable national environment all these decades. And that's really something that kind of South Asian Islam can really be a model compared to Wahhabi Islam or compared to what you see coming from West Asia. And so India and Indonesia together really can do much collectively to establish this kind of model. And the Chinese should be, should perhaps drop certain reservations about dialoguing with countries like India on such subjects, which is not happening. In my own experience with China, and I'm talking of my years in China as ambassador, that the way the bureaucracy does business there, despite 40 years of reform and opening up, nothing really seems to have changed about the way the stock phrases that are used, the kind of talking points that are used. You can play them over and over again like a broken record, I think.
Yep, go ahead, Dan.
You make, I think, a valid observation that India and China should see terrorism similarly and should see the regional threat similarly, and yet they really don't. And you mentioned Lashkar-e-Taiba, and I would say that's a poster child for the difference in perception of these groups. From India's perspective, LET is clearly a terrorist organization that means to do as much harm to India as possible. From China's perspective, Lashkar-e-Taiba folks and those associated with them in the Pakistani state are deserving of a degree of protection. Now, why? Because this gets at a fundamental difference over Pakistan. And of even if China were to come to appreciate the threat posed by Pakistan and by terrorists based in Pakistan, it actually perceives a very different way, a different and correct way of dealing with that threat. So from the Chinese perspective, Pakistan is sort of a wayward and troubled society in which these types of organizations operate and that the state, if anything, needs to be strengthened to withstand that problem. And they need to be rooted out over time through socioeconomic projects and so on and so forth over a long period of time. From an Indian perspective, these are controlled proxy organizations that are used kind of in a clearly Machiavellian or manipulative, nefarious way by the state against Indian interests. That's a fundamental difference, and that the Pakistani state, by the way, isn't nearly as weak as they make out to be. So, and because India and China have such fundamentally different views of the state of Pakistan and of its relationship with these terrorist organizations, that is the stumbling block to their seeing a broader means for cooperation on addressing those specific organizations.
And, but that's a good point, though. And, Lashkar-e-Taiba is still a significant group. We're almost at the 10-year anniversary of the Mumbai terror attacks, which everyone in the world, except for Pakistan, thinks were staged by Lashkar-e-Taiba. But, Dan is right. China sees this group so differently from India. Its viewpoint may have evolved very slightly in the sense that now you hear India's government condemning Lashkar-e-Taiba by name in these global forums, these BRICS forums, things like that, more so than in the past. But still, there's a significant disconnect, and clearly that's an obstacle to better relations between China and India more broadly. So unfortunately, we've come to the end. I think this has been a terrific discussion. We had a terrific presentation by Ambassador Rao, excellent commentary by Dan Markey and Yun Sun. If you could join me in a round of applause for our speakers. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming, and we're adjourned.